What title did you hold?
The World Wrestling Federation title.
Who did you wrestle against to get that?
Hulk Hogan and Bret Hart.
You've probably seen the headline. Yokozuna reveals the wrestlers he never forgave. It sounds huge. It sounds like a man finally telling the truth after years of silence. Almost none of it holds up once you actually look at the history. Rodney Inoue, the man behind the character Yokozuna, passed away in October 2000. He never sat down for a shoot interview about grudges. He never made a podcast appearance listing enemies. He never got the chance to respond to a single one of these videos because none of this digital media existed while he was alive. Everything in this kind of story is built after the fact, pieced together from other people's memories, and then repackaged for clicks. So here's the strange part. When you actually go back and read what his peers said about him, the picture that comes out is almost the total opposite of unforgiving. Bret Hart, The Undertaker, Rikishi, Lex Luger, nearly every major name from that era describes Rodney Inoue the same way. Gentle, generous, a stabilizing force in a wild, chaotic locker room. A giant who used his size to protect people, not to hold on to old wounds. So why do these videos keep getting made? Because professional wrestling was built on blurring the line between what's real and what's a show. That's not an accident. That's the entire business model. For decades, wrestling operated under a code called Kayfabe, where performers were expected to protect the illusion that rivalries, injuries, and grudges were real, even backstage, even off camera, even in interviews. That system worked great for selling tickets in the 1980s and 1990s. It works even better today for selling clicks, because decades later, nobody has to protect anything anymore. Old interviews get chopped up, real professional frustrations get mixed in with scripted violence, and the natural physical stiffness that comes from two 500-pound men colliding in a wrestling ring. Stir all of that together, slap a dramatic thumbnail on it, and you've got a video that racks up millions of views, whether or not it's actually true. There's one more thing worth knowing before we start. None of the 10 stories on this list are made up out of thin air. Every one of them is based on something that genuinely happened, a real match, a real angle, a real backstage moment, or a real comment someone made in an interview years later. The distortion isn't in the raw material, it's in what gets left out. A frustrated comment gets separated from the professional context that produced it. A stiff-looking match gets separated from the planning and trust that went into it. A safety-driven boundary gets separated from the reason that boundary existed in the first place. Once you put that missing context back where it belongs, the unforgiving Yokozuna story falls apart almost every single time. There's another piece of context that matters here, and it rarely makes it into these videos at all. Rodney Inoue's physical size wasn't static throughout his career. It changed dramatically, in stages, and those stages line up almost perfectly with the biggest storylines people now misread as personal drama. Early on, wrestling under the name Great Coquina, he was under 400 pounds and remarkably mobile, known for power moves and surprising athleticism. During his championship run, from 1992 through 1994, his weight sat in the 500 to 550 pound range, a level he was reportedly able to control with real precision, which is exactly what let him headline back-to-back WrestleManias as a dominant, safe main event heel. Then, from 1995 onward, his weight climbed sharply into the 600 to 800 pound range, a period defined by declining stamina and, eventually, a company-driven push to get him medical help. Almost every controversial moment on this list happened during one of those transitions, and almost none of it was hidden from the people around him. His peers watched it happen in real time. That's an important thing to keep in mind as we go through these 10 names one at a time. Here are the 10 men most often named in that story, counting down from 10 to 1. We're going to look at what the storyline claimed, what really happened backstage, and why the difference matters. Number 10. Steve Austin. At SummerSlam 1996, Yokozuna faced a rising young talent named Steve Austin, in a match that most fans don't even remember today. Late in the bout, Yokozuna climbed to the top rope to deliver his signature bonsai drop. The rope snapped underneath him. He fell backward. Austin rolled him up and got the pin. If you've seen a clickbait video about this match, you already know the framing. They call it a disaster. An accident caused by Yokozuna's declining physical condition. Some videos go further and claim Austin was furious backstage, refusing to work with Yokozuna again because of how dangerous the spot had become. That is not what actually happened, according to the historical account of the match. The rope breaking wasn't a mistake. It was a planned, gimmicked spot, rigged in advance specifically because of Yokozuna's size. Austin spent the entire match carefully avoiding leaning on the ropes because he already knew what was coming. The whole point of the finish was to give the match a memorable, dramatic ending while protecting Yokozuna's credibility as he transitioned out of the main event picture, and at the same time handing the rising Austin a high-profile win over a former world champion. Austin has spoken positively about Yokozuna's professionalism from that period, noting that even as his health declined, Rodney remained safe and easy to work with in the ring. There was no accident here. There was no anger behind the scenes, just two professionals executing a planned finish exactly the way it was drawn up. Think about what that match actually needed to accomplish. Yokozuna was on his way out of the main event picture by 1996, and Austin was still building toward the run that would eventually make him one of the biggest stars in the industry's history. A rigged, dramatic finish let both of those stories move forward at once. Yokozuna didn't get pinned clean in the middle of the ring. He went down because of a freak equipment failure, which protected him. Austin got a genuine, high-profile pinfall victory over a former world champion on a major pay-per-view, which boosted him. Everybody in that match walked away with something. That's not the outcome of a match gone wrong. That's the outcome of a match that went exactly right. Number 9. Mabel. In 1995, Nelson Frazier Jr. was pushed as King Mabel, a dominant heel character built around his enormous size. Off camera, though, Mabel had developed a rough reputation. Multiple top-tier wrestlers had already been legitimately hurt working with him, including a moment where he dropped his full weight onto the Undertaker's face and fractured his orbital bone. In an industry built entirely on trust between opponents, that kind of track record travels fast. Yokozuna and Mabel wrestled each other several times, and their most infamous encounter came at In Your House 4 in October 1995. It did not go well. Mabel botched a bulldog attempt, failing to bring Yokozuna down cleanly, and the whole sequence fell apart. Yokozuna stumbled awkwardly out of the ring and ended up collapsing onto ringside announcer Jim Cornette. The match ended in a sloppy double countout that fans and critics alike consider one of the worst main events of the era. Clickbait retrospectives love to frame this as a personal feud, as if Yokozuna simply hated working with Mabel and let it show in the ring. But that framing skips over something much bigger. This wasn't a two-man problem. It was a company-wide concern. Professional wrestlers depend entirely on their opponents to protect their bodies during high-impact moves, especially at that size. When a performer consistently fails to do that, it doesn't just create tension with one rival, it creates tension with everybody who has to step in the ring with him. Yokozuna's frustration with Mabel wasn't rooted in dislike of the man personally. It was rooted in a very real, very justified concern about physical safety, shared by much of the active roster at the time. It's worth pausing here to point out how different this is from a genuine personal feud. A personal feud is about two individuals and whatever history exists between them. This was structural. Any wrestler who stepped into the ring with Mabel around that time faced the same basic risk, regardless of their relationship with him outside of work. Yokozuna wasn't singling Mabel out because of some private grudge. He was reacting to a pattern that plenty of other wrestlers on the roster had already experienced firsthand. When that In Your House 4 match fell apart in the ring, it wasn't proof of hatred. It was proof of exactly the risk that made so many wrestlers uneasy about working with Mabel in the first place. Number 8. Hacksaw Jim Duggan. Rewind to early 1993. The WWF is positioning Yokozuna as an unstoppable monster heel from Japan, managed by Mr. Fuji, built to strike fear into the heart of the promotion's most patriotic characters. Enter Hacksaw Jim Duggan, a wrestler whose entire identity was built around American pride, waving a flag and swinging a 2x4 to the ring. Their televised collision became one of the most talked about squash matches of the year. Yokozuna dominated Duggan, then delivered 4 consecutive banzai drops in a row, before finishing the humiliation by draping the American flag over Duggan's motionless body. The broadcast sold it as brutal and one-sided, with commentary suggesting Duggan was coughing up blood and needed to be carried out on a stretcher. Some retrospective channels present this as evidence of real stiffness in the ring, implying that underlying tension, or even nationalistic resentment, caused Yokozuna to take genuine liberties with Duggan's body. That reading doesn't match what people who were actually there have said about it. This was, by every account, a meticulously executed piece of classic wrestling theater, built specifically to draw a big reaction and strong ticket sales during Yokozuna's rise as a top heel. Off-camera, Duggan and Inoue reportedly had an excellent professional relationship. Yokozuna's precise control over his own body ensured that Duggan came out of that dramatic sequence completely unharmed, despite how devastating it looked on television. This is exactly the kind of scene that gets pulled out of context decades later and sold as something sinister, when in reality, it's simply good, safe, effective wrestling storytelling. Consider what the story was actually trying to do. Yokozuna needed to look unstoppable, and Duggan, as one of the most beloved patriotic babyfaces on the roster, was one of the few opponents who could make that squash feel genuinely threatening to the audience. The image of an American hero draped in his own flag, seemingly defeated by a foreign monster, was designed purely to make fans furious enough to want to see Yokozuna get his comeuppance later on. It worked exactly as intended. None of that theatrical intensity required, or even benefited from, any actual bad blood between the two performers. If anything, the opposite is true. A move that dramatic looking, repeated 4 times in a row, only works safely when both men trust each other completely. Number 7. Lex Luger. On July 4, 1993, aboard the USS Intrepid, one of the most iconic visual moments of the era took place. Lex Luger, freshly repackaged as an all-American hero, arrived by helicopter in front of a live audience and successfully body-slammed the seemingly immovable Yokozuna. It was the opening shot of a summer-long, flag-waving program between the two, and it made Luger's push feel instantly massive. Because that push happened so fast, and because it was so heavily backed by the company, some retrospectives suggest that it created deep resentment inside the Anoa'i family, painting the picture of Rodney quietly stewing over being used as a prop for someone else's rise to stardom. What that narrative leaves out is the basic mechanics of professional wrestling. Body slamming a man of Yokozuna's size is not something one performer can simply do to another. It requires real cooperation. Yokozuna had to precisely shift his own center of gravity and essentially help launch his body upward at the right moment, or the slam simply doesn't work, and somebody gets legitimately hurt. That's not the behavior of a man secretly furious about being used. That's a skilled professional actively making his opponent look like a hero, on purpose, in front of a stadium crowd. The two of them went on to tour extensively together across the United States and Europe in the months that followed, and Luger has said for years afterward that Anoa'i was an exceptionally generous performer to work with, both in the ring and off camera. There's a lesson buried in this one that applies to a lot of the stories on this list. Fans, understandably, tend to focus on who won a given moment. Luger got the big visual, the crowd, the helicopter, the headline. Yokozuna on paper was the one who got beaten, but professional wrestling rarely works that way behind the scenes. The performer on the losing end of a spot like that is often the one doing the most work to make it look convincing, and Yokozuna's willingness to physically assist in his own slam on a national broadcast in front of a live military audience says a lot more about his professionalism than it does about any resentment toward Luger's push. Number 6. Shawn Michaels. This one is more layered than the others, and it's worth taking slower because it actually involves real backstage politics, just not the kind these videos usually describe. By the mid-1990s, a group of wrestlers known informally as The Clique, made up of Shawn Michaels, Triple H, Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, and Sean Waltman, had accumulated a lot of real influence over WWF's backstage decisions and creative direction. Around the same time, Yokozuna was seen by many as the central figure of a separate, informal locker room group known as the Bone Street Crew, which existed largely as a counterbalance to the Clique's growing pull. According to Savio Vega, tensions between the two groups came to a head when he learned the Clique was working behind the scenes to get him fired. Vega has said that Yokozuna overheard members of the Clique discussing exactly that plan and confronted them directly and forcefully, warning them against sabotaging a hardworking colleague's livelihood. On the surface, that story sounds like a personal feud between Yokozuna and Shawn Michaels specifically. It wasn't really that. It reads much more like a locker room leader stepping in to protect someone who couldn't protect himself, using his size and standing to push back against a faction with real backstage power. And there's a second story that complicates the picture even further. Sean Waltman has recounted an incident in Moncton, New Brunswick, where members of the Clique found themselves badly outnumbered outside a nightclub by a hostile local crowd of roughly 50 people. According to that account, a car pulled up and out stepped Yokozuna, The Undertaker, Rikishi, and The Godfather. The crowd scattered almost immediately. Two rival backstage factions, real political tension between them, and yet when things actually got dangerous, they showed up for each other without hesitation. That's a much more honest picture of locker room life in that era than Yokozuna versus Shawn Michaels ever was. It's genuinely one of the more revealing stories about how backstage life actually worked in that period. Wrestling locker rooms in the 1990s were competitive, political, and occasionally tense, exactly the way any high-pressure workplace with a small number of top spots can be. But loyalty inside the business often ran along different lines than creative rivalries did. The Bone Street Crew and the Clique could disagree fiercely over how bookings were handled and who had influence over the direction of the show, while still operating under an unspoken understanding that, out on the road, in unfamiliar towns, they looked out for each other. Reducing all of that down to Yokozuna hated Shawn Michaels erases almost everything true and interesting about the relationship between these two groups. It's also worth pointing out that Michaels himself has never been the one telling this story as a personal feud with Yokozuna. That framing comes almost entirely from outside retellings, built around Vega's account of the confrontation, rather than from Michaels describing some ongoing conflict of his own. That distinction matters. A genuine, acknowledged rivalry between two people people, usually shows up in both of their retellings over the years. What actually survives here is a single confrontation, described by a third party, about a group decision rather than an individual grudge. Turning that into a lasting one-on-one feud between Yokozuna and Shawn Michaels specifically requires filling in gaps that the historical record simply doesn't support. Number 5. Ahmed Johnson. Ahmed Johnson, real name Tony Norris, debuted in the WWF in late 1995 with a fast, aggressive push. One of the defining early moments of his run came when he inserted himself into a post-match brawl and successfully body-slammed Yokozuna in front of the crowd. In later shoot interviews, Johnson has claimed that established locker room figures, Yokozuna included, resented how quickly he was rising, and recalled Yokozuna telling him something to the effect of, "I hope you can get me up, because I'm not going to jump for you." Told on its own, that sounds like plain jealousy from an established veteran toward a hot new talent. The context that usually gets left out changes the picture considerably. Johnson had, by that point, developed a genuine reputation backstage for being stiff, uncoordinated, and legitimately dangerous to work with, having already injured multiple other performers, including Ron Simmons and Rikishi, through careless execution of basic moves. When a veteran refuses to actively assist a newer wrestler through a move like a body slam, that's not petty ego. It's a very old, very deliberate locker room mechanism. Heavyweights would routinely force unproven or unsafe workers to physically earn a maneuver through pure strength, rather than getting an easy assist, specifically to make sure that worker understood and respected the physical stakes of what they were doing to other people's bodies. Yokozuna's refusal to jump for Johnson wasn't about resentment toward his push. It was a veteran drawing a line to protect himself and everyone else who would eventually have to get in the ring with Johnson. This kind of unofficial policing rarely gets discussed outside of shoot interviews, and when it does come up, it's almost always misread by people outside the business as jealousy or bullying. In reality, it functioned as a kind of informal safety net in an industry with very little formal oversight of in-ring technique. Younger, less experienced wrestlers were often expected to demonstrate real control over their own bodies before veterans made things easy for them. It wasn't about status. It was about trust. And trust in a wrestling ring is the difference between a great match and a serious injury. Johnson's own account of what Yokozuna said to him, taken at face value, actually supports this reading rather than undermining it. Being told, bluntly, that you need to prove you can hold someone up isn't a threat, it's a test. Number 4. Vader. Early 1996. Yokozuna has shifted into a babyface role and enters a highly physical program with the recently arrived Big Van Vader, played by Leon White. On the April 8, 1996 episode of Monday Night Raw, the two put on a dramatic injury angle in which Vader repeatedly splashes down onto Yokozuna's leg, prompting the referee to stop the match and Yokozuna to be carried out of the arena on a forklift, unable to walk. Clickbait channels frequently present this as a legitimate injury, framing the stiff, physical nature of the match and the dramatic forklift exit as proof of a deliberate backstage burial and evidence of real hatred between two of the era's biggest men. The real story behind that angle is almost the exact opposite, and it's honestly one of the more touching details in Yokozuna's entire career. The injury angle existed for one specific practical purpose: to write Yokozuna off television so he could be admitted to the Duke University weight loss clinic, because his weight had climbed to a level that was genuinely threatening both his health and his ability to keep working. Far from treating this as a punishment or a burial, WWF management actually sent both Vader and Yokozuna to the clinic together. Jim Ross has told the story many times over the years, always with real affection, recounting that the two of them immediately undermined their own treatment program by sneaking out of the facility at night to eat fried chicken, and that both men ended up gaining weight during their very first week there. That is not the story of two enemies. That's the story of two friends going through something difficult side by side and finding a way to laugh about it even while it was happening. It also says something important about how the company chose to handle Yokozuna's declining health. He wasn't quietly released or pushed out once his weight became a serious concern. Management built a storyline specifically to protect him, gave him a legitimate medical off-ramp, and paired him with someone going through a similar struggle, so neither man had to face it alone. Vader, for his part, never showed any resentment toward Yokozuna over the angle. If anything, the fried chicken story that Jim Ross has told repeatedly over the years has become one of the more affectionate, human anecdotes associated with either man's career, precisely because it shows two larger-than-life performers behaving like ordinary friends who didn't quite want to follow doctor's orders. Compare that to how the story usually gets told online, as a tale of a forklift-based humiliation and a broken working relationship, and the gap becomes almost impossible to miss. The forklift was real. real. The televised injury was fiction, and the friendship underneath both of those things, the part that actually determined how Yokozuna's real health crisis got handled behind the scenes, was as real as anything in this entire list. Number 3. The Undertaker. Throughout 1994, Yokozuna and The Undertaker anchored one of the most brutal, high-profile programs in the company, built around a series of gruesome casket matches that dominated the main event picture that year. The violence on screen looked completely real, filled with outside interference, chaotic finishes, and genuinely unsettling imagery for the time. It's easy to understand why a modern viewer, watching those matches decades later with no context, would assume real heat existed between the two men. This might be the single biggest misread on this entire list. Off-camera, Mark Calloway and Rodney Anoa'i were, by every available account, extremely close friends, and together they formed the two central pillars of the Bone Street Crew, the very backstage group mentioned earlier. That group was built on shared travel schedules, mutual loyalty, and long nights spent playing dominoes on the road. Calloway has spoken about Anoa'i on multiple occasions with real warmth, describing him as a genuinely caring companion who possessed surprising agility and lightness on his feet for a man his size. Their on-screen rivalry didn't succeed despite their friendship. It succeeded because of it. The trust between two performers who care about each other's safety is exactly what allows a match that dangerous-looking to actually be executed safely, night after night, in building after building. Casket matches, by design, are chaotic, physical, and full of moving parts, from interference to weapons to awkward, improvised spots involving an actual casket prop. Pulling that off safely, over and over, across an entire year-long program, requires an enormous amount of coordination and communication between the two men in the ring. Communication that's far easier to maintain when the performers genuinely trust and respect each other. The Undertaker's later comments about Anoa'i, describing him as warm-hearted and surprisingly light on his feet, aren't just a nice tribute. They're a pretty direct explanation for why their matches worked as well as they did. A friendship like that, built off camera, is often the single biggest reason an on-screen rivalry looks as convincing as it does. There's also something worth noting about how the Bone Street Crew itself gets misread, because it existed largely as a counterweight to the political influence of the clique. Later retellings sometimes try to frame it as a group defined mainly by conflict and rivalry, existing purely in opposition to something else. That framing misses what the group actually was day to day, which was a genuine friend group, built around shared road trips, shared downtime, and shared trust, with Calloway and Anoa'i at its center. The fact that it also happened to represent a kind of informal counterbalance backstage doesn't make it any less real as a friendship. If anything, the strength of that friendship is exactly why the group held together at all. Number 2. Bret Hart. Bret the Hitman. Hart and Yokozuna traded the WWF Championship back and forth across 2 consecutive WrestleManias, first in 1993 and again in 1994. Hart was famously outspoken about wanting technically sound, believable wrestling, and was openly critical at times of the more cartoonish direction the company took during the so-called New Generation era. Given that, it's an easy leap for a retrospective video to assume that criticism extended to his working relationship with the much larger, more theatrical Yokozuna. It didn't, and Hart has been remarkably consistent and public about that fact over many years. He has repeatedly called Yokozuna one of the finest big men he ever shared a ring with. Despite carrying well over 500 pounds, Yokozuna had the strength, balance, and control necessary to protect his opponents through every high-impact move, including his finisher, the bonsai drop, where he would grip the top ropes and catch his own falling weight on his feet before settling down onto his opponent, rather than dropping his full mass directly onto them. That level of physical control is rare at any size, and it's especially rare at Yokozuna's size. Whatever real frustration Hart carried through that stretch of his career, and there was real frustration, it was aimed almost entirely in one direction, and it wasn't at Yokozuna. It's also worth noting how much responsibility Hart placed in Yokozuna's hands during those title matches. Hart was famous for wanting complete control over the technical details of his matches, and he simply wouldn't have handed the championship back and forth with someone he didn't fully trust to protect him physically, especially given the size difference between them. The fact that these exchanges happened not once but twice at the 2 biggest shows of the year in each of those years says a great deal about how much confidence Hart had in Yokozuna's in-ring judgment. That's not something a wrestler extends to someone he privately resents. There's also a broader point worth making about Hart's public reputation as a demanding, sometimes difficult critic of the era's booking. That reputation is well earned, and it's part of why the clickbait framing feels believable at first. Hart genuinely did clash with people during this period, and he was never shy about saying so publicly, later in his career, in his own book and in interviews. But that same directness is exactly why his praise for Yokozuna carries real weight. This isn't a case of a diplomatic wrestler saying kind, generic things about everyone he ever worked with. Hart criticized plenty of people from that era, sometimes bluntly. The fact that Yokozuna wasn't one of them, and that Hart instead singled him out repeatedly for praise, says a great deal about how genuinely positive that working relationship actually was. Number 1, Hulk Hogan. Which brings us to the one story on this list that actually does involve genuine, well-documented professional frustration. WrestleMania 9, 1993. Yokozuna defeats Bret Hart to capture his first WWF championship, becoming the first wrestler of Samoan descent to hold the company's top title. It's a massive historic moment, built up over months. Then Hulk Hogan walks out, ostensibly to check on an injured Bret Hart, and gets challenged on the spot by Yokozuna's manager, Mr. Fuji. Hogan accepts, and defeats the brand new champion in 22 seconds flat, title win and all. That decision undercut Yokozuna's championship moment almost the instant it happened, and by most backstage accounts, it did real damage. Both Bret Hart and members of the Inoue family were reportedly deeply frustrated by the booking, feeling that a genuinely historic milestone had been swept aside to put Hogan straight back on top of the card. The situation didn't fully resolve for weeks. Hogan eventually dropped the title back to Yokozuna at King of the Ring 1993, in an overbooked, somewhat convoluted finish, involving a ringside camera rigged to flash and disorient him at the right moment. Of everything on this list, this is the closest thing to lasting, legitimate professional resentment. And even here, it's worth being precise about where that frustration was actually pointed. It wasn't aimed at Terry Bollea as a person. It was aimed at the political maneuvering behind the decision, at a promotion that seemed more interested in protecting its biggest star than honoring a milestone moment for a rising one. That is a completely understandable human reaction to a real professional setback. It is not, by any account that has survived from the people who were actually there, the same thing as carrying a lifelong personal vendetta. It's worth being fair to just how big a moment this actually was, and why the frustration around it was so understandable in the first place. Yokozuna's WrestleMania 9 win wasn't just another title change. By multiple accounts, it represented something historic for the Inoue family. One of the first times a wrestler of Samoan heritage had ever been placed at the very top of the WWF's championship picture. Watching that milestone get undercut within seconds, on the very same broadcast, would understandably frustrate almost anyone in that position, regardless of their personal feelings toward Hogan. What separates this story from the others isn't the size of the frustration, it's the difference between reacting to a genuinely disappointing professional decision and carrying a permanent, personal grudge against the man standing on the other side of it. Every surviving account from that era supports the first reading. None of them, from the people who actually knew Rodney Inoue, support the second. It also helps to look at how the story actually resolved. If this had truly been about personal animosity, there would have been little reason for WWF to reunite the two men at King of the Ring just weeks later for a rematch, let alone one where Hogan dropped the title back. Whatever the internal politics were behind that overbooked camera flash finish, the promotion clearly still saw value in putting the championship back on Yokozuna and moving forward with him as the top heel. Companies don't typically build follow-up matches around performers who are locked in bitter, unworkable personal conflict. They build them around performers they still trust to deliver in the ring together, whatever frustration might exist about how a given moment was booked. Why these stories keep getting told the wrong way. It's worth stepping back for a second here, because the pattern across all 10 of these stories is remarkably consistent, and it tells you something about how digital wrestling media actually works. Professional wrestling spent decades training its performers to protect the line between what was real and what was a show. Interviews were often given in character. Backstage frustrations, when they existed, were rarely discussed publicly in detail, and when they were usually mixed in with a lot of exaggeration for effect. That system was built to sell tickets in a pre-internet world. It turns out to be almost perfectly suited to a different kind of exploitation today. Modern retrospective channels take isolated, decades-old comments from shoot interviews, strip away all the professional context around them, and present them as flat, literal truth. 10 names, 10 stories that all sound like hatred sitting right there on the surface, and every single one of them turns into something else entirely once you actually look past the thumbnail. If a person's true character shows up most clearly in the moments nobody's really watching, this is about as clear a window into Rodney Inoue's character as exists anywhere in the historical record. That's not the story of a man quietly keeping a list of people he'd never forgive. That's the story of a locker room leader people trusted with their bodies and their careers, over and over again, for years, in matches that could have seriously hurt any of them if that trust hadn't been real. Professional wrestling has produced plenty of real backstage conflicts over the decades. The next time a video promises to reveal the wrestlers a legend never forgave, it's worth asking a simple question before hitting play. Is this coming from someone who was actually there, speaking on the record, in context? Or is it a decades-old comment, stripped of everything that used to surround it, dressed up with a dramatic thumbnail because outrage travels faster than nuance ever will? In Rodney Inoue's case, the people who actually shared a locker room with him, who trusted him with their bodies night after night, who watched him quietly protect a struggling colleague when there was nothing in it for him, tell a remarkably consistent story. Not a story of grudges, a story of one of the most athletic, generous, and genuinely respected big men professional wrestling has ever produced.